Hi, I'm Beth, creator of Dry It, Can It. I like to share with you what I've learned as well as some tips and tricks for home canning, dehydrating, and more recently freeze drying. I am not an expert. I don't pretend to be an expert, but I do like to share with you what I've learned. More recently, I purchased a freeze dryer, and I chose the Stay Fresh freeze dryer for a lot of reasons. But yesterday, I put in some pickles, some olives, and I had some jalapeno peppers in my freezer, and I put those in. Pickles and olives are not commonly freeze dried. Pickles are, and there's been a lot of controversy about whether you should or shouldn't do those. I actually reached out to the Stay Fresh manufacturer and said, can I safely do pickles? Some of the people feel that pickles shouldn't be done because of all the vinegar and the salt, and they think it's hard on the machine. And I think if you clean your machine and you maintain your machine properly, you're probably fine. But I reached out to the manufacturer to say, hey, is this a detrimental? Is this going to void my warranty? Can I safely do that? And the answer was yes. But it also said that once you do that, you should change your oil. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And that I think is important simply because you have a pump that has oil in it and you don't want to be circulating any of the vinegars or the salts. What I decided to do is wait until it was time to change my oil. Now, and one of the reasons I chose the Stay Fresh freeze dryer is because I only need to change that oil every 30 times or 1,000 hours. With the Harvest Right, which is a popular one, you have to change it every 2 to 3 times, at least at the time that I purchased this and that I'm recording this video. I didn't want to mess with that. In addition, the customer service on the Harvest Right has not been that good based on the reviews that I looked at. And in fact, at the time that I'm recording this video, they actually had offers for people who bought that to write a positive video or a positive review and then get $100 credit or $100 in goods. That's just not what I want to do. I want something that's reputable. The Stay Fresh unit also is the only unit that has a probe in it, and the probe is another way to accurately determine, or more accurately determine, whether or not your food is in fact dry. Now, I dehydrate a lot of food, and I will continue to dehydrate a lot of food, but freeze drying has an advantage over dehydrating, and that advantage is that it removes 96 to 99% of the water, according to the research I've done, and depending on the food and your conditions, and that allows you to store your food long term. And by long term, I mean 10, 15, 25 years. With dehydrating, your moisture is removed to maybe 70 or 80%, which is still really good, and properly dehydrated, properly conditioned, and properly stored, you can store your food for a couple of years and be relatively safe. You may even get more years out of that. I didn't buy the freeze dryer with the idea of long-term storage necessarily, but we did want to start freeze drying things that are whole meals and some storage for emergencies. You think back to the COVID time when none of us could go to the grocery stores, or the grocery stores weren't even open, and sometimes, at least where I live, that was for a couple of weeks. So I want to have a couple of weeks of food and of meals in our storage, in our pantry, so to speak, so that I can use that. Also, we travel a little bit back and forth, different places, and to be able to just grab a couple of bags, add some water, and have food without having to have heavy coolers or having to have a cooler is another advantage. Now, I'm not doing this video about the freezer necessarily, but I'm going to go back to the whole idea of doing the pickles. And what I want to do is share with you, first of all, I want to show you what I did with the trays. What I did is I put the food on the trays, I put them in the freezer. This was pickles, olives, and jalapeno peppers. I put them in the freezer to pre-freeze. Now, your machine, or my machine, or any freeze dryer, will go through the freezing cycle and will freeze your food for you. But since my freezer is already running, since I had room on it, I put it in the deep freeze overnight, really for about 20 hours total. And that just saves some of the time in the electricity that would be used to freeze dry my food. So let me show you what that food looks like before I put it into the freezer. So here's what I have. I have some dill pickles that I rinsed twice until the water wasn't green. And then I put them on the tray, and any of the small pieces that had, you know, a smaller end, I made sure the wider end was on top. Then I have some garlic pickles. What I did with these is, and this is really important, is to go ahead, these were quartered in the jars, and I took them off, and I actually removed the seeds from them. I just ran a spoon down them, and then I took those quarters and cut those a little bit further down. I have some stuffed olives, and I rinsed those twice. They feel a little bit greasy, but that's just part of the olives. And then I have some jalapeno peppers that I took out of the freezer. And again, what I did is I removed all the seeds. Removing the seeds is really important because those are very difficult to get dry. So I'm going to put these in the freezer, and I'm going to let them freeze for 24 hours before I put them in the freeze dryer. When you first use your freeze dryer, at least for me, it was a little bit scary. I was kind of nervous about pushing the various buttons and afraid that I was somehow going to wreck the machine. But after 4 or 5 cycles, I really got comfortable with what I was doing. And let me show you a screen to show you what I do, or what the Stay Fresh freezer will do in terms of getting going. What I love about this machine is that it figures out how much time is drying, or how much time is needed for drying, pretty closely anyway. So in this particular case, I had put in the frozen pickles and peppers and olives, and I already had them frozen. And I did have a pause on the machine because I forgot to turn on the vacuum. So the freeze time really was about 15 minutes for the drum, but then the drying has been going for over 21 hours at this point in time. And my trap temperature, which is the drum, is at a minus 39. My shelf temperature, which is the second shelf, is at 113, and the goal here is to get that to 120. And the mTOR, the vacuum pressure, has been slowly dropping, which is good. Typically when something is finished drying, it's going to be, for this machine, anywhere between about 115 and 125. And once the drying is done, the machine will move to extra drying. Now I'm going to continue to walk through how the freeze dryer works because I think it's important to understand. So when I talk about shelf temperature, I have a 4-shelf freezer, and under that second shelf, that's the shelf that measures the temperature, and the freeze dryer has algorithms in it which will determine how long the food needs to be dried, and it'll determine that by moisture and by pressure. I'm not going to pretend I know the algorithms any more than that. When you see the trap temperature, in the freeze dryer there's a round circular drum, and in that my shelves go. That round circular drum collects the moisture and freezes that to the side. So that temperature is typically right around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That has to be that cold to trap that moisture. So how freeze drying works is different than dehydrating. Freeze drying basically freezes your food. Again, you can freeze it in the freeze dryer, you can freeze it ahead of time in the freezer. In my case, because I froze it in the freezer, then what's going to happen is that drum is going to freeze for about 15 minutes, and it very quickly will get to below Fahrenheit, below freezing. It'll get to about 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That's 72 degrees really below freezing. That will trap the moisture. Once that starts, the pump starts and the drying process starts. That drying process, you can set the temperature, it defaults to 120 degrees, and as the fruit is frozen, there's a process called sublimation, where basically the vacuum inside the freeze dryer will pull out that moisture, but it pulls it out as a gas, and that gas freezes to the drum. And that's where the freeze drying really comes from. So it's pulling out your food as a gas, not as moisture, not as water. So those are important measurements. And then the mTOR is actually your vacuum pressure. Somehow that pressure works to extract that gas, that moisture from your food. So those are numbers that I commonly watch. And as I've gone through the process for this particular load, and it's a relatively light load because I didn't feel those trays full, it's actually going to finish. It did finish at around 144, 143 mTOR, meaning the vacuum pressure. Generally, you want that to be at least under 500, and I think at least under 200 on this particular machine. So I'm going to take you to the next screen, which is going to show you the drying and the, and the extra drying also. And again, stay with me because it's important to understand how this works. And then I'm going to show you the freeze-dried olives and pickles and peppers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I'm going to store those short term. My freeze dryer is now in final drying mode. I had set the final drying for 20 hours, and I do that primarily because if I'm not around or if I'm sleeping at night, I can catch up later. But because I set it at 20 hours, I know that it's been in final drying for, a little bit less than an hour. Let's see, or a little bit more than an hour, a little bit less than an hour basically. So this, when it's in final drying, I can increase or decrease this if I had only, for example, 4 or 5 hours and I was worried. My TOR is at 144, which is a little bit higher than normal when I'm finished. My temperature is at 120, which was the goal to hit. And typically as the shelf temperature goes up, your mTOR will go down. But because it's in final drying, this is time for me now to weigh my trays and check and see whether or not they are done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the final drying. And do I want to pause this? Yes. And then what I'm going to do is open the vacuum and weigh my tray. Why do I want to weigh my trays, and how do I weigh them? I weigh the trays for this reason, and it's really an important reason and a good practice. And that is simply because as long as moisture is still coming out of your food is not dry. If you store that food, particularly long term, and there's still moisture in it, your food is going to go bad, plain and simple. And with the price of food and the time you're spending freeze drying, you really want to be sure that your food is dry. Now, how do I weigh that? Basically, I just have an inexpensive scale. The one I use has ounces, it has grams on it. You really want one that has grams on it. And that is because grams are much more precise than ounces. We in the United States have not worked with the metric system, and until I started doing freeze drying, I didn't know that there were about 28 grams in 1 ounce. So when I'm weighing my trays of food, that 28 grams gives me a much more precise measurement than just plain ounces. So typically when you get to, there's three steps, so to speak, with freeze drying. You're gonna have the freezing, which is the freezing of your food and the freezing of the drum. And again, my food was pre-frozen, so it was just the freezing of the drum, but you can freeze in the freeze dryer if you want to. You're going to have the drying, which is the machine drying the food. And then you get to what's called final drying. Final drying is where you want to weigh your food for the first time to see if it in fact is done. And then you want to wait about 2 hours and you want to weigh your trays again. And what you really want to do is make sure that your trays are the same weight. Once they're the same weight, you know that your food is dry and you're good to go. So let me show you that. I've weighed each of my trays and I've weighed them in grams. Now I want to check them in 2 hours to make sure that they don't lose any more weight. If they don't lose any more weight, then I know that my product is dry. But if they do lose weight, then I know that I need to keep drying. So I'm going to go back into final drying. It's going to ask me to make sure that there's no water, which there isn't because I haven't changed anything. And this is kind of a standard list, but basically this is a nice reminder to make sure that I have closed the valve again. And I'm simply going to hit yes, and now it's back to drying again. And you can hear that my pump started. So I'll be back in 2 hours to check this again. So here are the freeze-dried pickles, crispy. the freeze-dried olives, which I can literally smash, the freeze-dried pickles, and the freeze-dried jalapenos. I'm not going to touch them and break them right now. Freeze-dried foods will absorb moisture in a hurry, so I want to bag these up fairly quickly. So I already showed you the kind of the bands on the cans here. So initially, I'm just going to go ahead and put these right in the jars that they came from. Let's see, that was pickle. Here we go. Pickle. In the jars they came from, because they have the rubber gasket in them. And sandwich pickles. These will hold, because the covers have those rubber things, these will hold comfortably for a couple of months, and these actually are going to get used for this. Now, you can take these things and actually powder them if you want. Supposedly dill pickles are really good powdered and popcorn. Not sure that I'm going to try that, because my family likes pickles really more than I do. The olives were definitely something different. I'm not a big olive fan at all, but there is a family member who definitely is. And this doesn't perfectly fit, but I'm going to put this right back in the same container they came from. But olives, I thought, were going to be the biggest challenge, one of the bigger challenges. Now, with each of these vegetables, I guess they're vegetables, pickles, I rinsed these off really well in cold water before I ever put them in the freezer, because if you don't do that, they're going to be really, really salty. So that was something that was important. Now, interestingly enough, on these olives, some of the pimentos, mine were pimento stuffed, came out, but I'm just going to go ahead and put those in also, and put the covers on that. And that's really what you have. Then the peppers, I didn't bring a big enough jar for this, but I'm just going to go ahead and put some of these in a smaller jar and can them. And then I'm going to grab a Ziploc bag and put some more in there, simply because that'll hold it until I'm ready to package these up. So let me get the covers on this, and then I'm going to be back to wrap this up, and I'll talk about storage and a couple of other things with this. Okay? Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Most jars that have some kind of liquid, including spaghetti jars, will have this little bit of a rubber, not really a gasket, but a rubber lining around the cap. You can see that each of these jars have that. And while that's not going to be good for long-term storage, it will work fine for short-term storage. For me, short-term is less than 6 months. Have everything bagged or jarred now. Now again, these jars, because of the rubber, I don't really want to say gasket, but the rubber lining inside of them will keep the moisture out and keep these fine for a couple of months, probably up to 6 months, so I'm not concerned. But none of this is long-term storage. This can be long-term storage if I vacuum seal this jar, and I would probably want to put an oxygen absorber in there also. But I'm actually going to put my jalapenos in a bigger jar. I did bag the rest of them temporarily in a Ziploc bag, simply because I didn't have a bigger jar upstairs with me. It's downstairs. And again, the moisture is so removed from these that they will absorb the humidity quickly. And a Ziploc bag is not long-term storage, because even though it's Ziplocked, moisture will still get through there and moisture will get through the bag. But for a couple hours or even a day, that's really not a problem. But I'm going to put all of my peppers in a, hopefully a quart-sized jar. I'm going to vacuum seal that, and I'm going to put an oxygen absorber in that. These are actually going to be used in the next couple of months. 4th of July is coming up. We'll use some of these. Some of this is going to be a gift. So I'm not going to worry about putting these in long-term storage. If I wanted to put these in long-term storage, or any of your food in long-term storage, here are the guidelines on that. You probably want to use Mylar bags with the oxygen absorbers. Except for fruits or candy, you're best to use a desiccant. A desiccant works better with really sweet things, removes moisture. Oxygen absorbers remove oxygen. Now, it's not going to flatten your bag, because when the air you breathe is only about somewhere between 21 and 28% oxygen, there's still other air in there. But the things that are going to affect your long-term storage of your freeze-dried foods, and even your dehydrated foods, are going to be light, oxygen, and moisture. I have these in moisture-proof containers, at least short-term, they're fine. They're in glass jars though, so light is still going to get to them. I'll be storing them in the basement where light is greatly reduced, but certainly not eliminated. Oxygen, I haven't removed the oxygen in these because I'm going to be using them short-term. It would be better if I put them in a pint-sized or quart-sized jar and remove the oxygen. Or put in an oxygen absorber. I'm not going to do that just because we're going to be using these so quickly. But again, long term, you really want to store things with no light, no moisture, and no oxygen, using your oxygen absorber. Can you vacuum seal your jars? Yes, you can vacuum seal your jars. It's not going to be as efficient as using an oxygen absorber though. Let's see, Mylar bags. If you're going to buy Mylar bags, buy quality bags. Don't buy the cheap ones you're going to find on Amazon. You really need for long-term storage to have a 7 milliliter bag, and a 7 milliliter bag on both sides. A lot of them are advertised as 7 milliliters, but they're really 3.5 milliliters on either side. And that silver that you see, is not the Mylar. It's that plastic lining inside that's the Mylar. Personally, I won't store my food unless I know where the Mylar bags are coming from, simply because it's my food and I'm eating it, and I'm not comfortable with a bag that's coming from China and not really knowing how it's made or what's in it. I buy my bags made in the USA. I have a link below if you're interested in that. I also have a link to the Stay Fresh freeze dryer if you're interested in that, or even want to take a look at that. The link that I also have a code, DryCan, I think it's DryCan 50. It'll be the link below, but you can get $50 off a freeze dryer if you decide to buy one. Anyway, this is my experiment. The time that it took here, when I weighed the trays, all of the trays were good except for the pickles. I knew the pickles were going to be probably taking the longest, and I put those on the second shelf because that's where my heat source was. When I weighed them after they ran 21 or 22 hours, I weighed them and then I weighed them again, and there was a 2 gram loss. So I waited another hour, 20 minutes. I weighed them and they came out the same as that second reading. So I know that all my food is good. I know this is long. I know that hopefully most of you didn't even maybe get to the end of this, but if you did, I really appreciate that. Would really appreciate a thumbs up if you learned something. If you liked this, it helps the channel gets discovered, and then I can keep producing these kind of shows. And I hope to do more on freeze drying, as well as a review down the road on my freeze dryer as well. So please hit the subscribe button. I think that's in your lower right hand corner, which is my left, I guess. Thumbs up, comments on the video appreciated, questions as well. Thank you for watching. Happy food dehydrating, canning, or freeze drying.